Welcome to Curious Minds. It is September 11th, 2019. Originally, I thought I would talk about the street preachers that we had out on campus last week, but I think I'm going to go in a different direction because I've been doing a lot of research in a certain area, the area of slavery. We've had two atheists that I've had extended conversation with lately, and both of them have cited the issue of slavery and have questioned the validity of the Bible and or the character of the God of the Bible based on the institution of slavery. So I had heard some things about how to answer this issue of slavery in the Old Testament. Also, I've been engaging in a little more research on the topic, try to do a broad overview of this picture of slavery in the Old Testament and in the ancient world. So let me lay this out in a syllogism to try to help it make clear and concise sense. The entire syllogism is based on, I would say, three premises. Premise 1, God is completely good. This is how Christians tend to define God. Premise 2, God affirms slavery. And premise 3, slavery is not good. So given these three premises, you have one of two conclusions. These are similar. Either God is not good, or no such God exists. Now, the conclusion that you'll usually hear is that no such God exists, or this is proof that the Bible was written as a product of its time and not divinely inspired. If it was a perfectly moral God, he wouldn't have made exceptions for slavery. He would have said no slavery. So premise 1, God's completely good. Premise 2, God affirms slavery. Premise 3, slavery is not good. And I believe that given these premises, the conclusion would follow that no completely good God exists, or this representation of God is not completely good. And if God is completely good, then this God does not exist. So I do believe that would follow, but that's only if premises 1 through 3 are correct. So what we can do is deny premise 1, premise 2, or premise 3, or any combination. What would a denial of premise 1 look like? God commanded something bad, at least for a time, or God withheld full revelation for a time. So rather than God not being completely good, it could be that God did intend for something bad, at least for a time, whether to teach a lesson or to limit the effect of God on culture. Probably the weakest denial of a premise would be that one. How about denial of premise 2, that God affirms slavery? We could say God never actually affirms slavery. He only permits it because of man's corrupt nature. It is a human reality that God speaks correction toward. So in this case, you have slavery as something that's established in the world already, and rather than God overthrowing a norm such as polygamy, that was another thing at the time that was not immediately overthrown, God steers a ship rather than bombs the ship. He speaks influence over the thing, which would eventually lead to the eradication of any poor form of slavery. So the idea that God affirms it may not be true. And we'll look at the verses. What would a denial of premise 3 look like, that slavery is not good? Well, simply slavery can be good under certain circumstances. This sounds crazy to our ears now, but given the conditions of the time, slavery may have been a preferable way of economics, way of providing for oneself than any alternative, such as dying in famine. So keep those premises in mind, as well as their denials. And if the denial of any of those can work, the conclusion that no such God exists does not follow. Now, a little study on the word slavery, as it's found in the Bible. The Hebrew word abed or ebed, it has several definitions, and I found this interesting. It can not only mean slave, but servant, subordinate, minister, advisor, or official. How interesting that one word could represent several things that have varying degree of prestige in their roles. We think of slave as a position of low prestige, but an official or minister or advisor as a position of high prestige. But in any case, it's somebody who is submitted to a master. Now, I saw 72 uses of the word slavery in the Old Testament, and I categorized these 72 uses into situations where slavery is affirmed or permitted, where slavery is neutral, just simple reporting, or occurrences where slavery is actually requested upon the enslaved party, occurrences where slavery is opposed or spoken negatively about, or there's a set of passages with rules regarding slavery, and there's also passages of historical recall. And as we look at these 72, the biggest category is the neutral category, where a situation is simply reported. This begins in Genesis and goes clear through Zechariah. You have maybe 10 instances of slavery being spoken negatively about, opposing slavery, from Leviticus 25 through Micah 6:4. And in these cases, slavery is looked at as something that's not in the destiny of Israel a lot of times. It communicates being subordinated to another nation, where you're not in control of your law. There are several rules regarding slavery. Exodus 21, maybe the premier passage for these rules. And again, just because there are rules enforced does not mean the institution of slavery is being supported. It just means that in light of the things that are already taking place, here are some restrictions we need to begin to put in place. Now, what I find most surprising is the dozen or so occurrences where slavery is requested. A person or a group or a nation requests to be enslaved. And this begins in Genesis 43 and 44. And the origins of the nation of Israel going to Egypt was due to a famine. And they requested becoming slaves in Egypt lest they have no other provision for their own survival. So this can be viewed even as a step of mercy taken by Egypt to say, come into our nation, work for us, and you will have your means of survival. And this is what Israel wanted. This happens at other times as well. I don't have specific references, but several other occurrences. There is a person or a group that requests to work for another nation or group, to be enslaved by them, for lack of a better term, to be made their bondservants in order that they can have their livelihood met in a secure manner and have a sure place to call home. And at times, this was used to pay off debts as well. So slavery was not stealing a person's work and giving them no reward on behalf of it. Slavery was enforced in Israel to pay back debts, as well as to make provision for people who may not have had any other means of provision. And then in the category of affirming or permitting slavery, and I would say these are entirely a permitting, not necessarily an affirming. God never says slavery is good or any variation of that term, but here's how it's permitted, and it's in Leviticus 25. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you, that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you, to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. So this is the most, that I could find, the most clear permission of slavery. And again, if there are people, even from before that time and after that time, who are requesting to be made slaves, it appears that it's not always a negative thing. Where do you get those slaves? You get them from the pagan nations that are around you. Why from the pagan nations around you? It's because these people are given a role that is not a role of control, of mastership over Israel. These are the subordinates. These are not the authorities. That's how they maintain the rules and the governorship of their nation as it is. And when you're working for one who loves you, treats you with humanity and respect, then this position can be certainly a good thing. And there's examples of that, not just in the Bible with people requesting slavery, but through history, when slaves and masters have strong attachments that they develop for one another. Let's dig more into the meaning of biblical slavery as compared to our idea of evil Western slavery. Lexham Bible Dictionary, a couple quotes from it. Slavery could take the form of debt slavery, in which people sold themselves or their children to clear their debts. In other words, it's saying there's no examples of just going and stealing somebody because you want them to work on your property. That's not what's going on. You have something you owe to somebody, or somebody owes you a great debt. How do they pay? Especially if there's not a monetary economy as we see today. They work for you. They work off their debts. It goes on, slavery is better understood in the context of households, which would account for the diverse slave experiences, which in addition to torture, rape, and death could also include protection participation, and sometimes even influence in institutional affairs. And we just had the power come back on at the CSC, so that's kind of neat. If you heard the printer come on behind me, it's doing this in the dark at first. Power's back on. In the example of Greco-Roman slavery, this is a quote, "Many slaves were more economically secure than many free-wage laborers." The Old Testament seems to assume that slavery is part of the human experience and provides the Israelites with regulations for slavery. So when you're wondering what's going on in Exodus 21, the assumption that all the Israelites have is that slavery is happening, and here are regulations. And I would argue that slavery is happening in all the nations because it's the only means through which they had to create an economy which provided all the needs for the people, having owners and laborers. They call it slavery. I think there's a fair way to do that, and so long as there's a fair way to employ people, have people work for you, that is what they enforced through the word that would later become synonymous with oppressive slavery. Another quote from the Lexham Bible Dictionary: "While the Old Testament does not condemn slavery outright, the Bible could be read as showing a consistent theme of liberation from slavery." Consider Luke 4:18-19. Jesus came to set the captives free. In Galatians 3:28, it says there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile. Slavery is, quote, not endorsed, but accepted. So that's according to the Lexham Bible Dictionary. Now, interesting, as we look at slavery in the Bible, the first example is Israel's enslavement to Egypt. This happened through Joseph. We think of Joseph as a guy that got a high position in Egypt, but he was also called a slave. He had a position that many people would be eager to get, and yet he was called a slave to one of the authorities over Egypt. So a severe famine strikes the land, and actually it affects Egypt as well as the land of Canaan. So Joseph's brothers come, and they say, hey, we're in a severe famine. We would rather come and work for you, or they're actually requesting, can we please come and work in your land? We'll become slaves here. We'll work under you so long as we have our livelihood, our provisions met. So this is what led to the Israelites being enslaved in Egypt, something that they had desired in light of their economic situation in their homeland. Now, did slavery become a bad thing in Egypt? It sure looks like it. But it's not because they were working for the Egyptians, it's because the oppressive conditions that the Egyptians would enforce on the Israelites. And that's the natural trend of what takes place. When you have somebody work for you and there are not rules in place, the nature of that work is going to become, I would wager to say, more oppressive and more oppressive. And so the Israelite slaves eventually wanted to be free from that tyranny in Egypt, which then became a real large piece of the meta-narrative of the slavery that all people are under, as far as slaves to sin, slaves in a foreign land, under the rulership of another kingdom, and not under the kingdom of God. Another use of slavery was to make up for a debt. A great example of that's seen in 2 Kings 4, a story of Elisha. A man is working for a guy because he owes him a great debt, and the man dies before that debt is completely paid off. So what happens is the landowner is going to take the sons of that man and have those sons work for the rest of the years to make up for the debt that was owed. And what happens is Elisha says, go take your jar of oil, pour out the oil, and this huge amount of oil is present, and they pay off the debt with that oil. It becomes kind of the economic exchange. So there was a certain price that these people were working for, like a salary. Well, they had the money present to pay off that salary. Therefore, they did not need to work for that person any longer. So there was a corresponding exchange between working for somebody and paying something off. In Leviticus 25:50, see a similar thing taking place. The price of a person's sale will correspond to the number of years that he works. It's the days of a hired man that he shall be with him. Exodus 21:5 gives an example that certain slaves actually loved working for their master. And I think we still see examples of that in the New Testament. Now here's the major point that divides the Old Testament style of slavery from what we tend to think of as slavery, because we're used to hearing about the American tyrannical slavery. But Exodus 21:16 says that you cannot take a person against their will. The New Testament has examples of this as well. In 1 Timothy 1:10, the person who's a kidnapper, a slave dealer, as being one that is contrary to sound teaching. He's doing something that is not in line with God's will, nor is this ever said to be in line with God's will. You do not take a person against their will. The Bible only speaks against this. So there are people who want to become slaves. There are those who become attached to their masters, who enjoy working for their masters, who don't want to leave. And there's this restriction from kidnapping. It's voluntary. In other words, you sell yourself. And I used an example the other day of people maybe in professional sports. The NBA is my favorite. They sign a contract to play for a team. I will make your team money. I will work for your team, and you will pay me this. You are not your own. You have a master over you, and you have to live a life in line with that. You have to adhere to certain standards. I failed to mention earlier, slave is used 72 times in the Old Testament. Slavery is another 12 times, but every occurrence of this I would call a historical overview category. These all refer to Israel's former state in the house of slavery, their former slavery in Egypt. Every occurrence. Here's a few other Old Testament verses that would oppose what we think of as oppressive slavery. Here's Exodus 21:16, as I mentioned a moment ago. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Severe punishment for kidnapping. You don't take a person against their will. Well, how in the world do you get slaves then? Because they offer their service to you in exchange for provision and livelihood, or to make up a debt. Zechariah 7:9, this has the Lord of hosts said, dispense true justice and practice kindness and compassion each to his brother. Do not oppress the widow or orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. But, as happens through history, they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears from hearing. Oppression happens because of disobedience to the Lord, not because of obedience. Jeremiah 7:3, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not oppress the alien, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. So even for the lesser people, look out for their dignity. 1 Kings 9:15, King Solomon uses forced labor. Does this mean the Bible supports it? No. 2 chapters later, Solomon was said to have done evil in the sight of the Lord. Forced labor is not what God had in mind. So let's revisit the premises and the conclusion, and maybe turn this argument back on the person making it. Premise 1, God is completely good. I think that is still the case. Premise 2, God affirmed slavery. That is questionable. He spoke in Leviticus 25 and gave restrictions in Exodus 21, but I'm not sure that any of these could be God speaking in an affirmative manner. It was a permissible manner, given the situations at the time, but affirmative, not sure. And for what he said, as far as restrictions to slavery, would overthrow the American idea of slavery altogether. And it's no wonder that Christians were the ones who led the revolt against slavery. So premise 3, slavery is not good. Well, if slavery is not good, why are there people requesting to become slaves? And why are there people who love their slave masters and want to continue working for them? People were more free than we realize to leave their masters. There were restrictions about returning escaped slaves. So I think this premise is probably the weakest, that slavery can never, under any circumstances, be good. After all, Joseph's brothers from the land of Canaan said, we want to become slaves in Egypt because of the crop condition, the economic condition in our homeland. We have nowhere else to go. We need to work for you. And under conditions where the master treats the laborers fairly and justly, don't see that there's anything bad about this labor. After all, we are still working under other people. The vast majority of people in America are working for somebody else under certain restrictions and, frankly, making more money for the owner than they make themselves, and yet they're having their needs met. I don't have time to get into the complete economic logistics of what appropriate labor looks like. But suffice it to say, premise 3 appears very weak and does not appear to follow the historical record that slavery under no circumstances can be good. Now, is it overused in the Old Testament? Could be. Is it overused in the nations and throughout history? Could be. But this is not indicative of all historical slavery. Like I said, it has been because there have not been restrictions on the hiring of people that it would become more and more oppressive. That is human nature. That is why restrictions were placed in Exodus 21. So the conclusion that no such God exists does not follow any longer. Now, if we revisit premise 1 and premise 3 that use the term good, we can ask of the other person where they get the idea of good. What does it mean when you're calling something like slavery not good, or the oppression of humans not good? You're doing something to uphold human dignity and to imply an objective moral value. And this is something that people who deny God do not have strong rational grounds to do. After all, given the situation of a godless world, you would only have personal preference, and you could only say that your personal preference, which is an evolved instinct, a natural occurrence of chemical reactions occurring in the brain, leads you to have the thought that slavery is not good to you. But taking the leap from a personal preference derived in a being that's evolved accidentally, with no end in mind, with no design in mind, with only the view of survival and reproduction in play, a judgment about what can be ultimately good for society cannot follow. You need an objective standard of good to do so, and I will talk about that more down the road and look more at the moral argument for God's existence, how the idea of good must lead to an idea that an objective value giver exists. If humans have dignity and worth and should not be treated with oppression, that means that something has infused them with real value. But if real value exists in humans, you must admit there's some kind of intrinsic dignity that we have. Intrinsic dignity cannot come through accidental evolution, where survival and reproduction is the only means by which we have the preferences we do. What follows more from how we experience the world is that human dignity and value are real, that oppression of people is bad because human dignity and value is real, and that value comes from something else of value until you have an ultimate source of value, which is God. So if you're going to call slavery bad, you have to invoke something like an objective moral lawgiver to do so. You must stand on theism in order to begin to insult theism. And as we've seen, when you take the entire picture of slavery in the Bible and in the culture into perspective, the conclusion that no such good God exists does not follow. And even more so when you take the large picture of slavery into consideration as it fits into the entire narrative of God's dealing with his people. We see that we were slaves to one thing and we become slaves to another thing. Everybody's a slave to something. You will serve something. You can't serve two masters. So choose which master you'll serve. You'd be a slave to sin, a slave to the flesh. We'd be a slave to righteousness, a slave to God. That's why the apostles were not ashamed to call themselves slaves to God or slaves to righteousness. It's not a shame to serve somebody so long as the one you're serving is worthy of your service. All right, gotta go with that. This is Evan Van Sickle here at the Christian Student Center, where the power is now back on this September 11th, 2019, for the Curious Minds podcast, where I hope that you are inspired to think well about the things that matter most. Look forward to having further conversations. May God bless and guide you.